Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Asma. I'm a grants program specialist with the OVW Training and Technical Assistance Initiative. Very happy to have you all here today. And our webinar today is focusing on language access. And we're joined by Cannon Han, who leads our ITARC project with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. It is the Interpretation Technical Assistance Resource Center. And thank you so much, Cannon, for joining us and sharing your expertise. And over to you.
Thank you, Asma, and hello everyone, and Happy New Year. First of all, our thoughts are with all of the people in Los Angeles who have been experiencing just a terrible tragedy with all the fires. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. There's a lot of expertise in the room, so definitely, and I've worked with some of you in the past, so if you have any thoughts about what we're talking about today, any insights, if you want to disagree with me, please jump in and disagree with me. And I'm really excited to be talking to you today a little bit about the Interpretational Technical Assistance Resource Center and what kind of support we can provide for you all. And I'm going to start us off by just having a conversation around some of the topics that we most frequently get requests for providing training and technical assistance. If you do have any questions or comments, if you could drop them in the Q&A, that would be great. And Mackenzie is going to read them as they come up. So the Interpretation Technical Assistance Resource Center provides TA and training to OVW-funded grantees, national organizations, state coalitions, local programs on language access and interpretation. And so our expertise focuses around Title VI compliance, language access plan development and implementation, spoken language interpretation, sign language interpretation for deaf victims and survivors who do not use American Sign Language, compliance with state and federal language access laws and policies, focusing on bilingual advocacy and interpretation and making a clear distinction between the two. And we also compile resources and materials for grantees on language access. And that goes from sample language access plans from other agencies, trainings, resources that have been created around domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. And really what I like to say is we're kind of your one-stop shop on language access. So anything related to language access, you come and ask us. And if we don't have the knowledge on staff, we help find the people that have that knowledge. Some of the areas we've received more frequent requests around technical assistance is compliance with other agencies and organizations. So where OVW grantees are working with or partnering with other agencies, frequently law enforcement or courts or other local government agencies who aren't providing meaningful language access. And so working with the grantees to provide some training and capacity building to ensure language access. Another area that we've stepped into, what we recognize is that there aren't a lot of interpreters, particularly qualified interpreters, for many of the grantees to access. And so we do provide training on interpretation skills building with a focus on trauma-informed interpretation skills building. So hopefully when you walk away with this, you understand kind of what Title VI and the language access requirements are, 2 to 3 considerations when working with survivors, and then also identify some resources to help improve your language access plan. So we're going over a lot of things today. All 3 of these topics could be 2-hour webinars by themselves. So I'll be going a little fast. So don't worry, our job is focusing on helping you address all these issues. So this hopefully won't be the last time we all talk together. Just in terms of number 3, identifying resources to help improve your language access plan, the first thing you can do is put my contact information in, and you've checked one box already. So really quick question, and you can put this in the chat. How many of you in your organizations currently have a language access plan? And just a yes or no. So I'm seeing a lot of yeses and a couple no's. And what I will say is, even if you don't have something written down, you do have something, right? And so you do have a plan. It may not be written down, but you are doing something. So, I do encourage you to take the time to write down what you're currently doing, because, and as we're talking, having a plan is so important. And as we're talking, we'll kind of highlight the challenges that come up and why having a plan is going to help you address some of those challenges. And so why are we talking about language access? And, obviously there's the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. It's also a condition of receiving federal funds. But what I like to do is kind of talk about my experiences while doing direct services and really kind of center us on why language access is so important for survivors, and in particular for the work that we do and why it's important to us. So some of you may have heard this story, but I do like to share it because it highlights a lot of important things. A long time ago, when I was practicing law, I used to assist and represent individuals who were on involuntary psychiatric holds. And so my understanding, a lot of states, or most states, have something similar. So in California, an individual can be placed on an involuntary psychiatric hold as a danger to themselves or a danger to others, or they can't provide for their basic needs. So the first hold is a 72-hour evaluation hold. Based on that evaluation, an individual can be placed on an additional 14-day hold at the request of the hospital. And then additionally, the hospital can request something called a Reese petition in California. And what that does is it takes away that individual's right to refuse medication. So essentially, they are forcibly medicated with psychiatric medications that they don't want. So my job was to represent individuals at their hearings. So if a 14-day hold was going to happen or a Reese petition was going to happen, they had a right to speak to an administrative hearing officer and also be represented by an advocate or attorney. So I arrived at the hospital and I opened up the file, and it was a typical case, right? Very typical. So 911 was called. Husband reports that his wife is not taking her medication and that he's concerned for her safety and the safety of the children, right? So in the police report, it's all there. And then the police arrive at the scene, talk to the husband and the parents, and based off of that, say that she's a danger to herself. So they check that box, danger to others, parentheses, children, and they take her to the psych unit. The evaluating psychiatrist quotes the police report, diagnoses her as paranoid schizophrenic catatonic. Danger to self, danger to others, parentheses, children, unable to provide for her basic needs, right? So essentially, the family's not willing to take her back. So she would, if they released her, be homeless. The treating psychiatrist that requested the 14-day hold and the petition, the Reese petition to medicate her, quoted the police report, the admitting psychiatrist report, diagnosed her as paranoid schizophrenic catatonic, non-responsive, refusing medication. And so danger to self, danger to others, parentheses, children, unable to provide for her basic needs. So when I looked at it, I was like, honestly, I was like, cool, early lunch, right? She's catatonic. She's not going to talk to me. But the name, and when I looked at the name, it was a very Korean name, right? And so I was like, well, as we work together, you'll get to know my Korean is terrible, right? It's really bad, but I can say hello. So I was like, I'll just try to say hi to her, right? And so I walked up to her on the psych unit, And I told her, "Hi, I'm your attorney." And I said this in Korean. "The hospital wants to keep you here and give you medicine. You can stay and take the medicine and just sign here. Or if you want to leave, you can talk to a judge today." And she looked at me and she said, "Yeah, I don't want to be here anymore. I want to go home." So obviously not catatonic, right? What was she? She just didn't speak English. She didn't speak a single word of English, right? And so, I advised the hospital, I let the administrative hearing officer know that she was speaking in Korean. They had to get somebody in Korean. And unfortunately, the hospital was unable to bring somebody that spoke Korean. And so at no point did the hospital ever advise her of her rights or take the time to speak to her about the risks and benefits of treatment. I was eventually able to find a social worker, and this was probably about her third or fourth day on the psych unit, a bilingual Korean social worker, to accompany me to the psych unit to speak with her. And so we sat down, and the social worker spoke to her less than 5 minutes, walked to the nurse's station, walked back and asked her, "Will you take this?" and presented medication to her. And the woman said, "Yes, I'll take that. That's my medication." So the whole time that she was refusing medication is she was exercising her right to not take medication she did not recognize, right? And at no point did the hospital bother to find out what she was taking and offer her that medication. What we found out much later was that in this particular instance, what happened was that the three English-speaking people who were relied on to make all these decisions about this woman were the husband and the in-laws. And what they actually had done was withheld her medication to send her into crisis so they could have her call police and have her arrested. Right? So with that fact pattern, right, not knowing that this had happened, you have somebody that's been diagnosed by 2 psychiatrists as paranoid schizophrenic. Right? And we have, in addition to that, we have law enforcement that have identified her as a danger to herself and a danger to her children, in addition to the 2 psychiatrists. If there was going to be an order of protection, who would get the order of protection in this case? Just based on that fact scenario, right? The husband would get the order of protection. If she filed for divorce, would she ever get custody of her children? So when we're thinking about language access and we're talking about language access, and understanding what the failure to provide language access has on survivors and their lives and the choices they make, think about all the systems that survivors encounter, right? And this is just a really quick, and I really like the complexity of battered women's lives that was created in partnership with Ellen Pence and, oh, I forget, another TTA provider. It escapes me at the moment. But we consider survivors encounter immigration. There could be a domestic violence or arrest report. Very similarly, in this particular instance, it's the victim that's been arrested, right, and placed on a psych unit. But we have not identified her as a victim in the system. There could be family court. There could be child protective services. They could have engaged with public benefits. There could be an order of protection. It's very possible the order of protection could be on the wrong person. Right? So consider the multiple systems survivors encounter, and consider that the first time anyone attempted to speak to them in a language that they could understand and communicate in is when they're sitting right in front of you. Whether you are a bilingual staff person, advocate, or officer, or you pull in a qualified interpreter, consider that. Like, we, in terms of how we provide assistance and how we identify options for survivors and what course needs to be taken, we rely on information. And for us and for me, when I was practicing, if it was written down by a police officer, or I had a decision from the court, or I had a mental health professional, doctor writing something, if it was written, I believed it to be true. But what if it's not true? Because the doctor that we're relying on, who's diagnosed our client or our suspect, right, as a paranoid schizophrenic, but in fact, the doctor has never spoken to our client or our victim or our witness. How can we believe that all the information is true? So what I encourage you to do is not just in that immediate moment where we have somebody who doesn't speak English, right? Whether they're deaf, whether they're immigrant, whether they speak a little English, but not enough, or they just completely don't speak any English. Just consider the fact that the first time anybody's been able to talk to them where they've been able to share their side of the story, what's happened to them is when they're sitting in front of you. And think about all the information that you've collected and ask the question, hey, there was a 911 call 1 year ago and officers arrived at the scene. I have this report. Was there an interpreter there? Was there a bilingual officer? You were placed on an involuntary psychiatric hold. Did the doctor speak Vietnamese? Right? Or did they bring in a Spanish-speaking interpreter? Ask the question, because if an interpreter wasn't there or a bilingual person wasn't there to communicate to that person, we have to consider that what is written is not true. And how does that impact how you're going to proceed in helping this survivor? So the foundation of language access, and this is really important because a lot of times when we're having conversations, particularly with other agencies or organizations, is when they're not providing language access, is we turn to the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And so what Title VI says is no person in the United States shall on the ground of race, color, or national origin be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination on any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So what that basically means is if you're receiving federal funds, then all your programs and activities must be language accessible. And so an example that illustrates that is I've worked with a couple YWCAs. And so YWCAs have a multitude of services. And in this particular YWCA received a grant to provide assistance to sexual assault survivors. And so they were working on their plan and they were communicating to the managers of other programs that, hey, we're receiving federal funds now. You need to also be thinking about language access. And they actually got a lot of pushback. And so the computer literacy program manager was like, well, I'm not receiving any federal funds. Do I have to do it? And based on Title VI, because the YWCA is receiving federal funds, all programs and activities, right? And so to the extent and the types of planning and resources dedicated to language access, they're going to be different for the direct services to sexual assault survivors versus the computer literacy program, but the computer literacy program now has to provide meaningful language access. Also, if you are regranting funds, or you are passing federal funds to other grantees, you have to make sure that those grantees you're providing funds to are providing meaningful language access. So what does meaningful language access means? That means language assistance that results in accurate, timely, and effective communication at no cost to the LEP individual. So for LEP individuals, meaningful language access denotes access that is not significantly restricted, delayed, or inferior as compared to programs or activities provided to English proficient individuals, right? And so this is where language access plan becomes really important, because there are certain languages that we can expect, right? So Spanish is one of those languages that we can expect we'll encounter, right? But we don't get to pick who comes through our door asking for assistance, right? So what would you do if somebody came into your office and spoke an indigenous language like Mixteco? How would you communicate with that individual, right? Do you know that there are specific interpreting agencies that focus on indigenous languages that you could connect to provide interpretation services? There's one based in Los Angeles, another based in San Francisco, and another in Florida, right? So are they incorporated in your language access plan? So these are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about, because whether or not we're able to provide full services to them, we still need to be able to communicate with them, right? Even if we have an agreement with a culturally specific service organization where we refer clients who speak Mixteco to that agency, we still need to be able to refer them, right? So having a plan is really important. I know a lot of grantees were facing an influx of requests for assistance from Ukrainian, Dari, and Pashto speaking survivors, right? And reasonably certain those weren't in like people's language access plans, right? So how are you going to go about finding the resources to communicate with those survivors? How are you going to go about finding the interpreters if you need to interrogate a suspect, or you need to provide assistance at the court with a survivor who speaks Ukrainian? So that's where the plan is really important, right? So that you're not scrambling, so you know who to call and who to make the connections with. But also the plan is really important, because at the baseline, that's going to help you determine how much things are going to cost, right? I've worked with organizations who kind of just put a line item of maybe 3,000, 4,000 for interpretation. And as soon as they open up the doors and people realize that service is available, they've burned through their line item for language access in 3 months, right? So planning is really important, and you're not doing this in a vacuum. A lot of grantees have been working on it, and we provide that support. So if you need assistance in writing a plan, if you need assistance in updating a plan, this is why you reach out to us. And we work really closely with NCJ FCJ. NCJ FCJ is an incredible resource because they're constantly working with interpreters and translators. One of the most frequent questions I get is, well, how much should interpretation cost? Right? How much we want to translate our brochures? What is a competitive price for translating into Spanish, Korean, Vietnamese, and Arabic? Right? Like, who do you go to? Do you have any recommendations or agencies that you've worked with where you had a good experience? And so a lot of times I just reach out to NCJ, SGA, and Brianne and say, well, who have you been using and what does it cost? So I noticed there was a question. So it looks like recently we serve a survivor identified as Thai speaker and requested an interpreter through Orange County Court. And the court said they didn't have any interpreter available, while the list of interpreters for Thai speaking interpreters showed on the list as available. The judge asked our advocate to be the interpreter, and we didn't agree since some of the legal terms may not be familiar to staff, and she didn't feel comfortable doing it. The judge decided to reschedule the court date and asked us to come back with our own interpreter. How can we hold the court accountable to Title VI? Well, first, you did the right thing. You never want to put your advocate in a position to serve as an interpreter, particularly because that's not their job, and in addition to that, they're not a trained interpreter. I think one of the things that you can do is, and if you don't mind me asking, is this Orange County, California, or Orange County, Florida? If you don't mind answering that. I think, but in general, what you'll want to do is you'll want to take a copy of the Title VI letter to the courts from the Department of Justice, which highlights their obligation to provide language access. And send that both to the presiding judge and the court administrator for Orange County Court. And then you'll also want to send a copy of that. So you'll want to CC the Administrative Office of Courts, both the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the Chief Administrative Office of the Administrative Office of Courts. And if you have in your state a language access working group at the Administrative Office of Courts, you'll also want to include them on a CC, notifying them that they are violating Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, right? And so, and in addition to that, you can include copies of recent memorandums of understanding or agreement between the Department of Justice and several of the courts. When you're ready to have that conversation and you want to take a look at how to write that letter, I've got a redacted copy of the Title VI complaint filed by the Los Angeles Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles. And we can kind of go through and identify all the appropriate people you'll want to send the letter to. Obviously, it's also strategic. I know in the past, advocates and attorneys have hesitated to complain about Title VI violations because they're concerned that the judges will retaliate against their clients. So, you know, we can have a more in-depth conversation around the best way to approach notifying the court of their Title VI violation. Finally, if you are prepared to, you can always file a Title VI complaint against the court through the Department of Justice website. And the process is really straightforward. You just go to the website and you can directly file the complaint, you know, detailing this, you know, the particular case where your client was refused an interpreter. But once again, this is something that, you know, you can reach out, please reach out to me. We can have a conversation about how to proceed. So one of the things, another question that came up was expanding on resources in addition to Language Line, and we'll have a conversation about that. Would I be able to write out the steps to get interpreters in court? Jessica, it depends on which state and which court you're in. So in New York City, so there is a process to request interpreters. New York has a pretty robust system that, you know, we can touch base offline, Jessica, and have a conversation about how to request interpreters in New York City with the court system, and also have a conversation about some of the challenges and barriers you're getting to or getting interpreters in the court. And across the board, we have been maybe up to about, in the last year, we've been hearing a lot from grantees that there have been issues with obtaining interpreters in courts. And so it's also really important for us to hear about the challenges that you're facing, whether it's courts, whether it's law enforcement, other direct service agencies. But in general, we all have been hearing that there have been issues in court. And so we would love to hear from you about some of the challenges that you're facing. And in this particular instance, Jessica, just reach out to me and I can walk you through New York City court interpreter request process. Another issue that we frequently hear about are complaints around the quality of interpretation, whether it's misinterpretation, biased statements. So there are a lot of challenges around that. And so Nita, some of the things definitely at a baseline, uh, LanguageLine is a service provider. And so what you'll want to do is when you put out a request for proposals or you're trying to identify a telephonic interpretation company, is to expand the search. So rather than typing in LanguageLine, you'll want to type in telephonic interpretation company, right? Because LanguageLine is like Q-tip, right? Everybody says Q-tip, but I go to the store and buy cotton swabs on a stick, right? Um, it's become LanguageLine has become synonymous with telephonic interpretation. So if you type in LanguageLine, that's what you're going to get. You're going to get the single company, and the challenges around telephonic LanguageLine we hear a lot of complaints about because they're the biggest company, but issues around delay, poor interpretation, biased statements. There are things that you'll want to build in regardless of who you use, whether it's LanguageLine or you work with different companies, right? Is making sure that in contract, right, you identify the type of service agency you are, and you ask LanguageLine to identify interpreters who have skill and experience and knowledge in that particular area. So if you're a domestic violence service agency, you let them know we're a DV service agency. Who are your interpreters who have experience in domestic violence in these languages? And we would like for you, the preference is to provide those interpreters on the call. Will you get them all the time? No, you won't, but you can at least make the request. Another thing that we encourage people to do is to create a blacklist for interpreters, right? So if interpreters, when they are on assignment, they're going to give you an identification number. So you write down the identification number. If that interpreter so if you get me as your Korean interpreter, I would be a terrible interpreter. So you say interpreter 1234 can never be assigned to our contract again. And then in addition to that, you want to make sure that your colleagues are aware internally that Canon interpreter 1234 is a bad interpreter. So if I end up on your contract and I somehow end up interpreting for you again, even though you've told the company not to assign me, right, that they will know to hang up on me and then call back and say, hey, I need another interpreter. You're not supposed to assign interpreter 1234 to our contract, right? In addition to that, we encourage grantees to identify those interpreters who they feel like do a good job. And so that when possible, what you'll want to do is when you're scheduling an interpreter, you call the agency and you request specific interpreters. What also helps is to develop relationships with individual interpreters. A lot of the interpreters I work with are willing to provide a nonprofit rate. And when you have those types of relationships, it helps, right? That's not always easy. That's not always possible. So I do encourage you to seek out other companies. And I'm not endorsing these companies, but obviously TNOLA is an agency that a lot of grantees work with, and they're providing our interpreters today. ALSA Language Services, LionsBridge. So there are a lot of companies that provide telephonic interpretation that you can have conversations with. At a baseline training and providing training to staff on how to work with telephonic interpreters and address issues, right? So one of the trainings we provide is how to hang up on a bad interpreter and request a new interpreter, right? So, for a lot of people, if you're like me, I mean, I'll spend 45 minutes talking to a telemarketer because I feel bad and I can't hang up on them, right? But if you have a bad interpreter, how do you hang up on the interpreter and let your client know, hey, it's okay, right? So at the baseline, just, once you've identified poor interpretation, right, telling the client, so you're speaking to your client saying, I have to make some copies I'm going to hang up on the interpreter, and when I'm done making the copies, I will call and get a new interpreter, right? And so that hopefully the interpreter interprets that, because you don't want to say, hey, this interpreter sucks. I'm going to get us a new interpreter. I'm hanging up on them right now, because we have, obviously the interpreter is not going to want to interpret that, right? And so in turn, then going back and calling, if LanguageLine is your company, letting them know this issue occurred with the interpreter. We are not paying for this interpretation. And you are going to provide me a new interpreter that is able to interpret, in domestic violence or in sexual assault cases. Another tool, and part of the reason why we had kind of branched into training interpreters and trauma-informed interpretation skills building, is we found that because there is such a small pool of interpreters that grantees are able to access that are trauma-informed, is to provide the training resource so that grantees can create their own pools of interpreters. And whether that's tapping into the language skill of existing staff and volunteers, whether that's recruiting college and graduate students and volunteers in the community. What we have found is some agencies have, because of the issues they're having with companies like LanguageLine, is working with them to build their own pools of interpreters. And to be honest, a lot of what we're doing is imperfect solutions, figuring out imperfect solutions and how to address those situations. And so when we're talking about limited English proficiency, it's evolved. And I think that, we have a lot of knowledge here. And so we're really going from a place where, when I first started working, limited English proficiency meant my grandmother, who the extent of her English was no English. Like somebody would talk to her and she would just say no English. And what we understand is now that the ability to speak and understand and communicate in English, it's impacted, right, by stress, by trauma, and by context and subject matter. And so a lot of times, just because somebody speaks English, we have to remember that they have experienced trauma. And so rather than asking, hey, do you speak English? We should be asking the question, what language are you most comfortable in communicating your story to me in, right? Because the details are so important, right? And the other thing that we found is that a lot of times the words and concepts don't exist, right? I work with my colleague Puna, who's on today, and I promise not to pick on her, but you can help me pick on her later. But we did the Power and Control Wheel Translation Project, and what we found, and so we were translating the Power and Control Wheel into Samoan, Chuukese, and Hawaiian, and what our language experts came back and told us was, we do not have the words in our language for power and control. Like within the context of an interpersonal relationship, we literally do not have the words, right? So how do you talk to somebody about power and control, about violence in the family, right? When the words don't exist, right? So one of the things we also need to recognize is we're working in a lot of communities where the words and language don't exist, the concepts don't exist. So then how do we talk to somebody about their rights and about what their experiences are if the words don't exist? And to that extent, right, how do we know that the interpreters are doing what we think they're doing if the concepts and words don't exist? And I'm hoping one of you will answer that question for me by the end of today. So we're going to go over some definitions really quick. So interpretation is the process of either orally or through sign rendering communication from one language to another. Translation is the written text, right? Preparation of the written text from one language into another. Very frequently, we don't make a distinction, right? Interpretation and translation, we use it interchangeably, but the profession makes a distinction, right? So a lot of times we get asked the question, well, Canon, I don't speak Spanish. How do I know they know what they're doing? Well, you can ask them what the difference between interpretation and translation is. And if they can't tell you, they've never received training, right? And so I've watched a lot of episodes of Doogie Howser. I know the words. Would you trust me to do brain surgery on you? Much the same extent, that's how interpretation works, right? Hopefully you wouldn't trust me, but if you ask the question that they can't tell you, right? Then the first thing I would tell you is get a new interpreter. But we don't live in a perfect world, and sometimes we have these languages where there's nobody else, right? And so now if you know, hey, this is the only option I have, but they've never received training, that's when you pick up the phone or you email us at the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, and you say, hey, we've got somebody who has no experience with interpretation. Can you talk to them and maybe provide them a little bit of training on ethics, on what the role of the interpreter is, right? And explain to them how you want to talk, how you want to interpret, right? What that looks like. You can't be summarizing. You have to convey everything and interpret everything that's being said. And in turn, we also need to be thinking about how do we prepare our client or our victim, witness, survivor? How do we prepare to them to work with an interpreter who maybe isn't as skilled? I also include qualified bilingual employee just to highlight, just because somebody grew up speaking the language doesn't mean that they're qualified to do their job in that language. And the easiest example I can provide is Spanglish, right? Somebody that grew up speaking Spanish but isn't fully fluent in the language, right, is not somebody that you want to place in a position where they're providing direct services in that language. There are 3 modes of interpretation. So simultaneous, consecutive, and sight. Simultaneous is what you see our ASL interpreters doing right now. Consecutive is the process of orally rendering one language into another language after the speaker has completed the statement or question. So that's something that we are more used to. So, and we're more likely to use. So what'll happen is I will ask my client a question, the interpreter will interpret, client will listen, client will respond, interpreter will interpret the response, right? The final mode of interpretation for spoken language is sight translation, right? So in spoken language interpretation, sight translation is, let's say we have a written document. Let's say we have a victim statement, right? It's written in Spanish. My interpreter will read the Spanish out into English, right? So that's sight translation. So 3 modes of interpretation. That's what's recognized. So that's what you can also ask your interpreter. Can you tell me what the 3 modes of interpretation are? If they can't tell you, they haven't received training, right? So you either ask for an interpreter. If there are no other options available, then you're reaching out to us and you're saying, hey, we've got somebody that speaks a language where we need an interpreter and we have nobody else. Can you talk to them and help prepare them so that they can interpret? Or in turn, if you want us to train your staff so then they can do that preparation with that individual, that's another thing that we can do for you. So qualified interpreter is an interpreter that meets requirements and standards recommended by the Department of Justice and established by your department or agency to interpret competently and accurately and ensure your ability to effectively communicate with individuals with limited English proficiency. And so I share this because qualification doesn't mean certification, right? Just because someone is a certified court interpreter, and certified court interpreter is considered the highest standard, doesn't necessarily mean that they're qualified to interpret for you. And so, and I'm sharing this just to highlight this, right? So qualification is really about what your needs are and who your clients are, right? And who you're trying to communicate with. So years ago, this was shared with me when I worked for the state of California in a sexual assault case at trial, right? Only two people spoke that language in the court. It was the victim and the court interpreter, the certified court interpreter, right? Victim was on the stand, ready to testify. The prosecution asked the first question. Interpreter interpreted in that language, and the victim shut down, right? And so what happened? Everybody was like, prosecution thought, well, they're a hostile witness. They're no longer cooperating. Crime victim witness advocates, people just generally thought, it was trauma, right? And people wanted to be sensitive to the fact that she was sitting in a court and her rapist was staring at her and she just shut down. Several weeks later, she disclosed to her community-based advocate, so not to the prosecutor, not to the victim witness advocate, and not to the detective, right? She disclosed to her community-based advocate that the certified court interpreter in court, when the interpreter was supposed to be interpreting, told her, no wonder you got raped. Look at the way you're dressed, right? So for us, the qualified interpreter has to be somebody that is prepared and able, without bias, to interpret for survivors, to interpret in context of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and dating violence. We've worked with grantees for years now, and we continue to get reports where interpreters are telling survivors, don't report him, you'll get deported, you'll bring shame on the family, husbands can't rape their wives, right? So for us, we need to be asking questions of our interpreters. We need to be asking questions of the companies that we work with to confirm that they are qualified based on our standards to interpret for our clients. And just to highlight the difference between bilingual and interpreter. So somebody that's bilingual staff, they're conducting their job in that language, right? And that requires a level of fluency in the language to effectively communicate. An interpreter is that conduit of communication. And years ago, the state of California did an assessment of what it takes to effectively interpret in the court setting, right? And it really does align with our work. And they identified 26 different knowledge, skills, and abilities, right? And native-like fluency was one of those 26. And this is just, once again, to highlight that you cannot ask somebody that's bilingual to interpret unless they have training and experience to actually interpret, right? It's not a one-to-one skill set. The interpreter's role is to facilitate communication between two or more people who use different languages, and to place the non-English speaking participant on equal footing with those who understand English. The interpreter's job is to render everything said in the source language into the target language accurately without omitting, adding, embellishing, or summarizing anything spoken or written. And the reason why I highlight this in our conversations is because so often, whether we're working with the court or whether we're working with an interpretation company, how many times have we been in a situation where we feel like, or we know that they're not interpreting everything accurately, that they're omitting things, that they're adding things? And so we need this language because when we're having conversations with the court or we're having conversations with the company, we can use this language to say, this interpreter is not doing their job. And so really quick, before we go back to the Q&A, I'm going to do a really quick interpretation exercise with you. And this is going to be for consecutive interpreting. So I am going to read, let's see, 2 sentences to you all. And what I'd like you to do offline in your space is attempt to recite back in English what I've just read. Bonus points to anybody that can do it in another language. Okay, so here we go. Paying full registration renewal or planned non-operation P&O fees by the due date prevents penalties, but does not permit you to operate the vehicle. California Vehicle Code CVC Section 9552-9554. Note, make sure your license plate number appears on all forms of payment, electronic and paper. So 2 sentences. Just really quick in the chat, what are your thoughts on that exercise? Was it easy? Was it hard? Did anybody think to try to take notes? Yeah, so too many acronyms and jargon, very hard. Context, right? We're talking about language access, we're OVW grantees, and I'm talking about the DMV stuff. Talking too fast, right? Complicated, right? I will tell you the best interpreters, and if you noticed our ASL interpreters were interpreting along with me, right? That's what qualified interpretation looks like. That's what we want, but that's not what we always get. And what I like about this exercise, and the question comes up, is how do we know the interpreter knows what they're doing? What I encourage you to do is to take and create your own 2 to 3 sentence. Context specific to the types of services that you're providing. And you can read that to your interpreter. And if they can't do it from English to English, I guarantee you they can't do it into another language, right? So at a very quick baseline, you can establish that. The great thing also is you are, because it's context specific, you are also including words and language that they'll need to encounter and be able to identify whether or not they're comfortable with the words and language, right? Another great thing about this tool is it establishes a baseline on potentially how you can effectively work with the interpreter, because we don't always get that trained, qualified professional interpreter, but we frequently have to work with somebody because nobody else that we can find speaks Quiche, right? Quiche is an indigenous language, right? So we find somebody. They're not a professional interpreter, but they speak English and Quiche. So how do I work with this person, right? And what it helps you do is it identifies kind of how much memory retention they have, right? So if they can't do the 2 sentences, then you can work with them and maybe you speak at this pace. Paying full registration renewal or planned non-operation fees by the due date prevent penalties, right? So it provides a framework in how to effectively work with that interpreter, right? And also it's a guide for you to explain to your clients or to the LEP survivor or witness or suspect. It provides a framework where they understand this is how, and this is the pace in which we're communicating. Because it's not natural, at least for me, I can talk nonstop for like 18 hours, right? Without breathing, right? But it's not a natural way to communicate for a lot of people. So we want to provide that guidance so that we ensure that we're getting all the information, right? We don't get always the most qualified. So we have to identify how to most effectively work with the interpreter that we have available to us. So in the questions, should notes, directions, or engaging with interpreters and when to disengage be included in your language access plan? It doesn't have to be in your language access plan, but it should be a component of your training program for staff, right? So tied to your language access plan, I encourage you to include trainings for your staff on how to work with interpreters. Also, how to communicate with clients on how to work with interpreters. And so we've got some draft language that you can incorporate into your trainings about explaining how to work with interpreters to your clients. And in addition to that, we do provide trainings on how to work with interpreters. So if that's something that you want to build in to the trainings, so your language access plan should include training for staff, right? If you want help in building out your trainings on your staff, whether that's us providing the training for your staff, or you want us to train people on your staff to provide the trainings to your staff, right? Train the trainers, we're happy to do that. We can't recommend any companies directly, but if you want to reach out to us, we can provide you a list of companies that have been shared with us by other grantees that they have been using. So, and Lisa Marie, you noted in Lakota, our words are descriptive. We did not have words, abuse, rape, etc. We describe, not using words, describe what is happening, right? And so, that's really important, right? Because as English speakers, I'm going to be confused because if I say abuse and my Lakota interpreter is, and my Lakota interpreter is trying to explain what abuse is, right? I'm going to be concerned because I think, hey, it's just the one word. And that's also why it's so important for us to connect with our communities, right? And whether that's reaching out to the Institute or other OVW grantees so that we understand the cultural context of language, right? Language and culture is intertwined. And for us to be able to effectively communicate and serve survivors, we need to understand that in Lakota, if we have a Lakota survivor, that the words don't exist. And so that things have to be described, right? So then me as an advocate, attorney, or investigator, when I'm asking them to describe the rape, I know not to say, well, can you tell me about when you were raped, right? I know that I'm going to have to be more descriptive because we don't want to place the interpreter in the position where they take on the responsibility of describing. And if we don't take the time to understand that in Lakota, that the words don't exist and it is a language that requires description, right? Then there's going to be breakdowns in communication. Lisa Marie, at some point, I think that you and I would love to do a presentation to you kind of on navigating those challenges around communication to highlight that so that English speakers understand the challenges around language and concepts. Because I think a lot of times we as English speakers, we presume that all systems and people understand our systems and the way that we talk and communicate about violence. And so another thing I want to highlight, and this kind of ties into Lisa Marie's comment about language and description, is creating glossaries around terms and terminology, right? So what we have is the verbs of violence, right? So how people talk about, and say things like rape, like strangle, punch, or even the concepts around consent, right? It's very possible the words don't exist in that language. So what would be the appropriate interpretation or translation, right? And so we really do encourage the creation of glossaries that you can use internally, but also share with your interpreters and translators, right? And just as a baseline, and I've been doing this over 20 years, and I just learned last year that in Spanish, there's no word, direct translation or interpretation for advocate, right? And people are using different things. So just as a fun exercise, since y'all are on the computer, if you want to just jump into Google Translate and type in and have them translate advocate, whether it's into Spanish or if you speak another language, type it in and see what you end up with. If you are like me and you are monolingual English speaking, what you can do in the exercise is type in advocate take the Spanish and then put the Spanish back in and have it translated back into English and see what you get. So advocate is a good one to try out. Consent and molest. And just, just give that a go, whether you use ChatGPT, AI, Google Translate, and in the chat, kind of provide the response that you got and how that went for you. So people are pitting abogado, defensor. Are those accurate? I've just, for our Spanish speakers, would you agree with that translation? And so it's the added complication, right? So if there is no accurate translation, what are we communicating to survivors, right? And how do we know that they are understanding us? And the additional complication for us is, this is one word, right? Consider all the different kind of content specific words that come up for us, right? That we just assume people will understand and that the interpreter can interpret, right? And a lot of times we encounter this because the concepts or the words don't exist. So a lot of times I've heard interpreters use the English. So I'll say advocate and they'll say advocate, right? But how do I know that the people understand? And so this is where glossary building is really important, right? Because you want to standardize languages, right? You want to be able to say, to tell interpreters, you want to be, and then also at that end, also it's really important to get community feedback, right? So you want community feedback because you want to understand the language and how people are talking and communicate. And in turn, you want that feedback loop. So if you decide, hey, when you're doing community outreach and you can say, you know what, much like Lakota, you're going to, rather than saying or picking a word for advocate, you're going to be explaining, describing an advocate, right? And then potentially you can attach a specific word to it, right? And then what happens is then hopefully you get more adoption and people start to understand it. But it's always difficult when someone like me decides this is the word and that's not communicated to the rest of the community, right? So, these are a lot of conversations and these are some of the things that we work with grantees on to build these glossaries, to have these conversations so we can start creating the tools so that you can better communicate with survivors and with your communities. And one of the things, and we've been talking about this throughout the conversation, is just trauma and interpreting, right? And we have to understand that trauma and interpreting, our communities are small, particularly many of our communities, including deaf communities, they're really small, right? And so the interpreters in the communities may be connected to our clients, to the survivors, right? And so the first thing you want to do is, for spoken language, you want to make sure that the interpreter is not known to the client or survivor, right? Because how do we know, and that we've encountered this where like the interpreter knows the family and is reporting to the family, to the perpetrator, hey, just so you know, your wife is requesting or looking at getting an order of protection, right? So to the extent that you can, right, and making sure that the interpreters understand the importance of confidentiality, right? That they know that they can be held liable if they breach confidentiality. And building into your process where you contact a different interpreter and you check in with your client and ask them, hey, how did that go with the interpreter? Were there any problems? I noticed that you stopped talking, asking them Did you recognize the interpreter's voice? Do you feel like you know the interpreter, right? That's what you want to do for spoken language, right? And incorporating that a check process in there so that you can make sure that everything is effectively being communicated. In addition to that, asking open-ended questions. So if the client came in and you discussed an order of protection, right? Getting another interpreter and asking the client, can you explain to me what you understand an order of protection to be, right? And if they have no idea what it is after you've spoken to them, it's very possible that it's because the previous interpreter wasn't interpreting accurately, right? So having that quick check. One of the things that is different from the hearing community and the deaf community is that if you have a deaf client come in, my understanding of what's been explained to me is that you want to ask the deaf individual if they have an interpreter of preference, right? Deaf individuals are constantly navigating the hearing world, right? Every single thing they do involves using an interpreter, whether it's going to school or going to the hospital for a checkup or even just going to the DMV. They're interacting and working with interpreters on a regular basis. So there are interpreters that they work with regularly that they're very comfortable with. So what you'll want to do is when you're working with a deaf survivor is to ask them, do you have an interpreter of preference? And if they do, I encourage you within your power to do everything to work and contract with that interpreter. Not all interpreters are trained and thoroughly knowledgeable about trauma-informed practices, about domestic violence and sexual assault. So going back to the verbs of violence, another thing I encourage grantees to do is to pick 3 or 4 words off of that list and ask the interpreter, right? Ask the interpreter to interpret. Ask them what the interpretation would be for those 3 words, right? So ask them right off the top, I've got 3 words for you. How would you interpret them? And this is assuming we've already created our glossaries and we've also phonetically spelled out what the interpretation or translation would be. So I would ask them, how would you interpret jump? Does everybody know what I mean by jump? If you do know, share it in the chat, right? So how would you interpret jump, masturbate, and semen? Right? Because people that are uncomfortable with the content of the language may not be comfortable interpreting masturbate. I would also include expletives because some people are uncomfortable with it. But it's the language of violence that we're thinking about, and we don't get to choose what's going to be said, right? A police officer I work with was reviewing the interview of a rape suspect, and in the transcript, the detective asked, "What happened?" And the response was, "We made love." So the detective I work with, who was reviewing the transcript, that doesn't sound right, and so that detective did a spot check and reviewed the audio recording. And what the suspect actually said to the question of what happened, the suspect actually said, "Yeah, I fucked her." Right? Making love and fucking somebody is different. I think we can have consensus on that, right? If you're investigating this, what's the statement you want going in court, right? But what happened was the interpreter wasn't comfortable with saying fuck. We need to identify that in advance, right? And people will say, yeah, I've got experience interpreting in sexual assault cases. I've interpreted over 20 years, but ask them, okay, here are 3, 4 words. How would you interpret fuck? How would you interpret semen? How would you interpret rape? If they can't do it for you in that immediate moment, then you know that if it comes up, when you're speaking to the survivor that they won't be able to do it, right? We want to do this work in advance so that we don't encounter these issues and find out after the fact that there was a misinterpretation. So I'm going to go fast. I know I'm running up on a little bit of time. But so part of the work that we do is training for staff and OVW grantee staff on how to effectively work with interpreters. So, you know, we'll do a webinar, in-person training, and we'll practice with staff on working with interpreters, right? At the very first, what we encourage you to build into your training program is, and some organizations we've helped them develop scripts, but to make sure that you're conducting a pre-session with your interpreters, right? So where you're asking questions about, can you tell me what the 3 modes of interpretation are? Here are 3 or 4 words I would like you for you to interpret for me, right? You're gonna tell the circumstances to the interpreter. You're gonna say, hey, I'm meeting with a client who is a sexual assault survivor, right? Are you able to interpret? You know, can you tell me about your experience on interpreting for sexual assault survivors? You want to make sure that they understand everything is going to be interpreted. You'll want to develop cues, right? To make sure to inform both the LEP individual and the interpreter that a pause needs to happen, right? Because you need to slow me down. So before we all joined each other on this call, I spoke with all of our interpreters and I said, if I'm speaking too fast or I'm using terminology that isn't clear, I want you just to jump in and interrupt me, right? For a lot of times, what it is a hand signal. So you'll raise your hand, right? And then the LEP individual will understand to slow down or pause, right? Or in turn, the interpreter will raise their hand. If you've ever seen an interpreter at a conference waving their hands frantically in the back, right? It's because there's an issue with the communication, right? So having some way to pause people, right? Whether the interpreter is pausing you or you are pausing the client or survivor, you want to be aware of that. Conducting team interpreting for events that last longer than 2 hours. That's the general recommendations for spoken language, right? I want to highlight for American Sign Language. I would say if you're looking at an hour, you'll want 2 interpreters, right? And I generally do recommend 2 interpreters even at an hour, right? Just because the interpretation, the ability to interpret, the memory, and the fatigue, it does start to fit in. So you'll want to have team interpreting. And in addition, what's great about team interpreting is that the interpreters are able to communicate with each other and do quick checks on accuracy, right? That's not something that we can always do. We may not actually have the budget very frequently for team interpreting, but you know, if you're conducting a long interview, you're going to want to consider bringing in team interpreters. Use simple, straight, direct language. So you're going to be talking directly to the LEP individual, not talking to the interpreter, right? And back. You'll want to maintain communication with the LEP individual. So line of sight, eye contact communication, rather than everybody talking directly at the interpreter. And I've actually been involved in situations where we are all looking at the speakerphone because we were using a telephonic interpreter, right? So definitely don't want to be that. Interpreting, it's going to take longer, and you just have to account for the time that it will take, particularly if you're working with a lesser skilled interpreter, right? So if your intake normally takes an hour, you're looking at, you know, 90 plus minutes to 2 hours, depending on how skilled the interpreter is. Don't be afraid to step in. If you identify an issue, and I'll be honest with you, go with your gut. If you feel like something is going wrong, you know, you can always ask the interpreter. A qualified professional interpreter will explain to you, oh, you know, this is what's happening, right? There definitely shouldn't be any side conversations happening. But if you feel like something's wrong, the qualified professional interpreter will tell you, this was the issue, this is how I'm addressing it, right? If they can't explain it to you to your satisfaction, you're hanging up and getting a new interpreter. And always thank your interpreter. Building that relationship with your interpreter is really important, because I don't know how many times I've been bailed out by the interpreters I have relationships with that I work with regularly. Because there are always those instances where there's like a last minute unexpected call. And, the interpreters I've worked with, they're incredible. So if they can't help me out, they'll reach out to their network and say, hey, um, they'll say, this is a good person to work with. Because the other thing is you have to remember, like, how well you treat your interpreters, they talk to each other, right? And they'll say, yeah, don't work with Cannon, he's terrible, right? But if you have a good reputation working with the interpreters, they will go out of their way to help you out when you're in those kind of sticky, messy situations where you're scrambling to find a solution. Asking interpreters about their credentials and experience. And so, don't just ask the question, well, are you certified? Because that can mean a lot of things. So asking them who certified them and in what languages. For us, the additional complication is we need people who can interpret for survivors and victims, right? So asking them who they, do you have experience interpreting in stalking cases? Oh, you do. Who have you interpreted for? Right? Asking that level of questions. That's a lot of the pre-homework that you'll do when you're contracting with agencies. But when time allows, just to do a quick check with the interpreter and be able to ask them, hey, I have a client coming in and they're a sexual assault survivor. What's your comfort level? Have you ever interpreted for a survivor? And then asking here are 3 or 4 terms I'd like you to interpret. Spotting a bad interpreter, right? So just really quick. And so we spent some time on training for staff on how to spot bad interpretation. And it's tricky when you don't speak the language, right? But baseline is, can you understand the interpreter? Does the interpreter look confused? Are there side conversations, right? And a lot of that is also in terms of having staff practice, right? Working with interpreters. And you can build that into your contracts with companies and say, hey, I would like for you to provide some training for my staff on working with your interpreters, right? And so then they would call in and conduct a practice session. So really quick, I did want to get into language access planning because there were some questions around that. We do have agencies have in the past shared their language access plans, right? Each of your language access plans are going to be tailored to what your situation, right? Because the resources that you have available to you, the location, who you're providing services to, they're all going to be a little bit different, right? And then the level of service that you're providing depending on the breadth of services you have. So there's some guidance out there, and the Department of Justice also has some really great resources on language access planning. But just in general, one of the things I want to highlight, when you're planning, whether it is updating your language access plan or you are writing a plan for the first time, it's so important to involve more people within your organization, right? I encourage you not to do this by yourself. And I've worked with a lot of grantees where one staff person said, this is important, I'm going to work on it, right? There's so many components to a plan, right? That, in terms of understanding how LEP individuals are accessing services, from reception to legal assistance to court accompaniment, but also you need to have people who are writing your grants and your budget and finance people involved in the conversation, right? So it is really important, and it is so hard to do it in isolation. So just in terms of language access planning, if you want to reach out to us and get some assistance on that, I mean, one of the first things I encourage grantees to do is to have a working group, right? And not just a working group of just staff people, but people that have budget authority need to be involved, because it's going to cost money. The Department of Justice has updated its guidelines in 2023. So elements of a language access plan right? And so I share that, and you can also access on the Department of Justice website. Really quick on translation, right? And so this is something that comes up frequently in terms of questions around how much this does it cost, and what should we translate in. And a lot of that is in terms of translation, and the planning around translation is the contract, right? You want to make sure when you're contracted with the translation company that they have something called localization, right? I've worked with a couple grantees where they sent it off, and this was Spanish, and they sent it off to a company, and it was they were really well-known national companies. And when they got it back and was shared with the community said, this doesn't make any sense for us, right? Because it was Spanish from Spain and not the Spanish spoken in the local community. And like many other languages, Spanish isn't just Spanish, right? You know, Spanish spoken in Los Angeles is different from Spanish spoken in New York, which is different from Spanish spoken in Kansas, which is different from Spanish spoken in Mexico on the border versus southern Mexico versus Venezuela versus Puerto Rico versus Cuba. Spanish is different. And so when you're translating something, you want to make sure that the translation company knows who they're translating for and that they're able to translate it accurately for that localized language, right? So localization is important. You want to make sure that it's built in, is that if there are mistakes in the translation, that you don't have to assume the cost for the correction, but the company will, right? So there are little strategies around translation on the front end that if you're looking at doing translations, to reach out to us and we can assist you on that. And so a lot of, I mean, we're looking at technology, and we frequently turn to technology, and we just use Google Translate. And just really quick, if you want to share stories, like what are your experiences around Google Translate? Technology has evolved. It's so much better than it was 5 years ago. But one of the things I want to highlight with mechanized translation and AI is it doesn't understand context, right? And so I was working with a victim witness advocate, and they shared this story. And so they were doing a follow-up with a survivor of sexual assault. And all they were doing, and once again, this was in Spanish, all they were doing was they just wanted to confirm their follow-up meeting with the survivor. So all they typed was just confirming our meeting next Monday. And they put it into Google Translate, and then they emailed it off, right? And it's a pretty simple statement, right? What they found out later is that what Google Translate actually translated and what the victim witness advocate sent to the survivor, it was just confirming our date next Monday, right? So the technology doesn't understand context. And the way that it understands context is just inputting data. They're not designing this software, this technology for survivors. They're not designing it within the context of trauma around domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking, right? It's designed around everyday communication, right? So it doesn't understand context. Will it eventually learn context? Probably, but will I be able to identify the appropriate context? So that's the first issue, right? It doesn't understand context. The second issue is that it's a learning software. So anything you put into this software, whether it's AI or Google Translate, it's put on a server that is accessible by engineers and anybody else that can get into their database. So if you are going to be using this technology, and I also want to point out, Department of Justice does not recognize mechanized interpretation and translation or AI as meaningful language access, right? But we also know that there are agencies or organizations that are using it. So if you are in a position where there is no other option, right, and you're using it, understand that it's saved on a server, right? So if you have concerns about safety, right, about privilege or confidentiality, right, don't put in any identifying information into these platforms. Names, addresses, anything that could be used to potentially identify your survivor, your witness, right? Be really careful around the use of the technology and keep it very basic. And at the end of the day, if you are using this technology, always follow up and have somebody that is qualified to review what was said, what was translated, what was interpreted. So there's some great resources out there. I like iSpeak cards that you can share with your clients so that they can advocate for themselves. We have translated materials in multiple languages. I'm going really fast now because we're running out of time. I also wanted to share with you a final resource because very frequently, once again, we don't have resources and information in all the languages that we encounter. Hotpeachpages.net. It sounds really bad, I know, but it's an incredible resource. It is a clearinghouse of information on domestic violence and sexual assault in over 115 languages. And these have been created by agencies similar to the grantees, all of you, around domestic violence and sexual assault. Right. And so here are examples of the language, some of the languages that exist, right? And so it's like, what is domestic violence? What is sexual assault? Just really simple, basic things that we might have information on, but we've got somebody that is Romanian, right? And we don't have any resources, right? So it's possible there may be some resources that can help you initiate the conversation with the person that's coming to you asking for help, right? So just to highlight once again, hotpeachpages.net. Don't put in .com because I don't know where .com will send you, but it might get you in trouble. So hotpeachpages.net. LEP.gov is a great resource. That's the clearinghouse for everything that the federal government does around language access. So that's where you will find the complaints, civil rights complaints against courts and other agencies, and the memorandums of understanding between the Department of Justice and the violating agencies. Great tools and resources on language access planning. You'll all find that on lep.gov. And there's my contact information. And we got like a minute for any additional questions or answers or anything anybody wants to share. We'll definitely provide the slides to all of you. And if I miss anything or there's any additional information or resources that you would like, please feel free to reach out to me directly. And there was a request, I think, to get, there are the resources.
And we will be posting the PowerPoint to the TA2TA website under the specific grant programs. And we'll also have the recording there as well. So if you have any questions and trying to find it, please feel free to reach out to TA2TA. We can help you navigate that section of the website.
And Lisa, there was a question from Lisa about opportunities for staff training. Just reach out to us directly around staff training. We're happy to do webinars for your staff. And if possible, if it makes sense and budgets permit, we can also do some in-person training for you all. And also what we frequently like to do is do trainings for grantees and their staff, but also partner agencies. And so to leverage your TTA services to help educate some of the partner agencies and organizations that you work with.
Thank you, Cannon. So definitely, I wholeheartedly agree. Just reach out to API. They are our comprehensive TA provider and language access at OVW, and they are more than happy to help you out. So this concludes our training for today. Thank you, Cannon, so much. Tomorrow's office-wide NGO webinar will be presented by the Battered Women's Justice Project, and they will be talking about the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence and Firearms that is funded through OVW. So we will see you all tomorrow. Thank you very much. Thank you, Cannon.
Great job. See you guys tomorrow.